Hacienda plane breaks world record. Warren Doc Bailey opened the Hacienda in 1956, which was known as Lady Luck during construction, and it was located on the south end of Highway 91 across from McCarran Field. The closest strip resort was the Dunes that just opened the year before. The first Hacienda general manager said that when this place was built, there was absolutely nothing here. At the far south end of the strip, the Hacienda sought a niche as a family-friendly resort with a go-kart track and huge pool instead of an elegant restaurant with nationally known headliner entertainers, an effort that earned the property the title of Hayseed Heaven. Locals said you can either go to Las Vegas or to the Hacienda. The budget 256-room resort only cost $6 million, while the Tropicana Resort opened 1 year later at a cost of $15 million. Many gaming executives thought that the Hacienda would struggle because of its remote location, even though it was the first resort on Highway 91 that would be seen by drivers coming from Southern California. So Warren Bailey was open to trying different ideas to market the South End Resort, and he welcomed suggestions from all of his employees. For the first few years, the Hacienda operated their own airline of up to 30 planes that offered a room, casino chips, meal, and a show for about the same price as a plane ticket on other airlines. Slot machine mechanic Robert Tim, who was a World War II bomber pilot and airplane mechanic, came up with the marketing idea of breaking the flight endurance record of 46 days that was set in 1949 in Yuma, Arizona. Bailey liked the idea and spent $100,000 to provide all of the financial support for the record-setting flight. Bob Tim went to Alamo Airways at McCarran Field to buy a 1958 Cessna 172, which to this day is the most popular airplane in the world, having sold over 40,000. The Cessna 172 was first produced in 1956, the same year the Hacienda opened. McCarran Field was established as Alamo Field in 1942, which was a private airport built by aviator George Crockett, who was a direct descendant of Davy Crockett, which is why George named it Alamo Field. Clark County bought Alamo Field from Crockett in 1948 and renamed it McCarran Field. That deal allowed George Crockett to keep his Alamo Airways aviation service at McCarran Field. Tim hired mechanics Irv Kinsey, J.D. Powers, and Dwayne Potter from Alamo Airways to modify the plane for the flight. It took about a year to make the changes that included removing 3 of the 4 seats, adding a foam pad for a mattress to sleep on while the other pilot would fly. They also added an autopilot system and a 95-gallon belly tank that increased the fuel capacity to 142 gallons. The plane would need special permission from the FAA to take off because it was 400 pounds heavier than the maximum takeoff weight. The plane was also retrofitted so that the pilots could change the air filter and oil throughout the flight. Radio personality and commentator Preston Foster was hired to act as the ground operations manager and to help with public relations. To increase interest in the PR stunt, the record-setting flight would also be a fundraiser for the Damon Runyon Cancer Research Foundation. The public would guess how long the plane would be in the air, and the closest would win $10,000. On September 21st, Jim Heath and Bill Burkhart broke the 46-day record by flying a Cessna 172 in the Dallas area over 50 days, which means the Hacienda now has to fly 4 more days to break the world record. By October 1958, there were 2 failed attempts because of mechanical problems that forced the plane to land. The longest of the 2 flights was 17 days. On their 3rd attempt, they were flying north of Las Vegas early in the morning when they saw a big flash in the dark sky, and they realized that they had accidentally flown into the airspace of the Nevada test site, which is about 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. The two pilots had just seen one of the 37 atomic explosions that was part of the Operation Hard Track 2 testing series. There was no damage to the plane, but the flight was eventually grounded because of engine problems, and Bob Timm fired his co-pilot. A few days later, on October 31, 1958, the United States, along with the Soviet Union, announced a moratorium on above-ground atomic testing. Timm went back to Alamo Airways and hired pilot and mechanic John Wayne Cook as his new co-pilot. Cook had worked on the same plane as a mechanic before Timm bought the plane. The fourth attempt began on December 4, 1958. 7-2 Bravo took off from McCarran Field and then flew back around to the airport, and officials observing the record drove under the plane as it flew low to the ground, and they painted a white stripe on the plane tire to verify later that the plane had not made a secret landing.
When they took off, they painted their tires from the truck. I guess they spray painted them or something. And then they were inspected every day so that you could tell that they hadn't landed any place on the interim.
For about the first week, Bob Timm and John Cook would fly around Las Vegas making sure that the plane was mechanically sound. Twice a day, the plane would need to refuel, so the plane would slow down to about 75 miles an hour, which was close to the minimum flight speed to avoid a stall, because the maximum speed for a 1958 truck with 600 pounds of fuel was also about 75 miles per hour. The plane would fly about 20 feet off the ground while one of the pilots would step outside on the platform, drop a rope down to the speeding Ford truck that was donated by Cashman Auto Dealership. Then the pilot would pull the gas hose up with a winch and hook up the hose to the plane's fuel port in winds that were about 75 miles an hour, which is the speed of a Category 1 hurricane. The refueling would take about 3 minutes, and during that time, they would also get food and other supplies as needed. The Hacienda chefs would cook gourmet meals, including steak, but all of the food had to be chopped up and put into a thermos in order to be given to the pilots through the rope system. The engine would gradually lose power after weeks in the air because of carbon buildup in the engine, so it took more gas to run the engine, which required more frequent refuelings.
They hauled all their food and supplies up. They had a truck that ran underneath the airplane.
The pilots would fly around the California and Arizona deserts doing large loops between refuelings that would usually take place around Blythe, California, which is on the Arizona border. Because of the first 3 flight failures, this fourth attempt would run through the Christmas holiday, and Bob Timm felt bad about missing Christmas with his 2 sons. So the support staff made a stocking with a parachute, and Timm flew over his Las Vegas home and dropped some candy canes to his sons as they waved at the plane. Greg Timm said years later, they flew by in the airplane in the daytime and tossed out the airplane candy cane stockings with little parachutes. As they floated down, my brother and I tried to snatch them before they hit the ground. Bathing for the 2 pilots would require standing on the outside platform naked and using 1 quart of water per shower. John Cook said in his journal that we got a quart of bath water, a large towel, and soap every other day. Mark Hall Patton said, in terms of going to the bathroom, they had a folding camp stool that they used, and they just bombed the desert. To pass the time, they would read comic books, do exercises, and count cars on the ground. The newspapers ignored the story for the first 30 days. Hacienda General Manager Dick Taylor said that the papers, detecting a publicity stunt, did what they felt they had to do. They deleted the Hacienda name from all reports and even went so far as to blank out the Hacienda name that was painted so large along the side of the plane. At one point, the refueling truck broke down. George Crockett, as part of his Alamo Airways Aviation Service, had a 1956 Ford Thunderbird that had been converted into an emergency vehicle that would be the first on the scene when planes crashed at the airport, which was common in the 1950s. So Crockett drove his Thunderbird under the plane and transferred 5-gallon gas canisters to the Hacienda, keeping the Cessna flying until the truck could be repaired. On day 36, which was January 9, 1959, Bob Tim fell asleep at night, and the autopilot flew for about an hour before Tim woke up. Bob said, "I flew for 2 hours before I recognized any lights or the cities. I made a vow to myself that I would never tell John what had happened." But John knew, according to his journal, writing, "It was 2:55 a.m., and Bob was fighting sleeplessness. On autopilot, fell asleep 4,000 feet over Blythe Airport, found himself halfway to Yuma, Arizona. Very lucky. We must sleep more in the daytime."
John was sleeping one evening, and Bob was at the controls. And John kind of woke up, and Bob's head was leaning against the window. And he said, "Bob," and Bob kind of straightened up. And John, that was all there was to that until the next day. And Bob admitted that he had fallen asleep. It was on autopilot. But here they were going down on autopilot in this canyon with walls on both sides of them. And they could have just gone bluey at that time.
On day 39, with more than 1 week left to break the record, the electrical generator broke down, which meant there would be no lights, no radio, no heat, no electric pump to pump the gas, and no more autopilot, which saved their life 3 days earlier. A wind generator was installed on the plane, but it provided very little power, just enough for the occasional radio call or small light. John wrote, "Hard to stay awake in dark place, can't use radio, can't use electrical fuel pump all gasoline by hand, using minimum lights. Don't realize how necessary this power until all of a sudden, sitting in the dark, no lights and panel to fly by, flashlight burning out. Can't see to fix the trouble if you can fix at all." On day 46, January 19th, they were forced to refuel at night because of the shorter days, and it was a new moon. John Cook wrote, "As black a night as I have ever seen." With no generator, the plane had no exterior lights, so the refueling truck had to line up with the plane by listening to the plane's engine. John Cook attached a flashlight to the winch's hook, which made it a little easier to grab onto the rope from the truck as it was lowered from the plane. Another vehicle had to drive about 300 feet ahead of the plane so that Bob could fly on top of the invisible road and stay lined up with the refueling truck. 4 days later, on January 23, 1959, the 50-day record was broken, but they wanted to stay in the air as long as they could. The carbon building up on the engine made it increasingly more difficult to climb up in the air with a full tank of gas after refueling. So on February 7th, in the early afternoon, 7-2 Bravo started to prepare to land at McCarran Field. A plane full of photographers were sent up to get photos in the air, including this one of John Cook pretending to clean the windshield. Officials observing the record drove a car under the plane as it made a low flyby to confirm that the white stripe was still on the plane tire before it landed. After landing, Cook said, "There sure seemed to be a lot of fuss over a flight with one takeoff and one landing." Robert Tim and John Cook flew a Cessna 172 for 64 days, 22 hours, 19 minutes, and 5 seconds, which ended up being about 150,000 miles, or about 6 times around the world. The Damon Runyon Cancer Fund raised more than $50,000. In 1968, George Crockett sold Alamo Airways and the famous Thunderbird to his personal friend Howard Hughes. After passing through several more owners, the Thunderbird most recently sold for $86,400, stretcher not included, at the 2006 Barrett-Jackson Classic Car Auction. Doc Bailey had the Cessna restored, and it was on display at the Hacienda Hotel for about 2 years before selling it to a pilot in Vancouver, Canada. Bob Tim died suddenly in 1976, and his son, Steve, decided to find the plane that his father talked about so much. Steve discovered that the plane was sold multiple times to owners all over Canada, including Edmonton and the Yukon, before finding it at a farm in Carrot River, Saskatchewan. The plane was returned to Las Vegas, was fully restored, and currently hangs over the baggage claim area in Terminal 1 at Harry Reid International Airport as part of the Howard W. Canyon Aviation Museum. A replica of George Crockett's Thunderbird is also at the museum. John Cook died in 1995. Many years after the flight, when reporters asked John if he would ever consider replicating the stunt, he replied, "Next time I feel in the mood to fly endurance, I'm going to lock myself in a garbage can with a vacuum cleaner running and have Bob serve me T-bone steaks chopped up in a thermos bottle. That is, until my psychiatrist opens for business in the morning."